Thank you very much. I'm most honored to be here. When I was invited, the secretary didn't warn me that I was supposed to make a speech. He just said I had to come and then fend off questions. Well, I hope that happens, because then at least I'll have something to think about. But he said I should talk for about 10 or 15 minutes on any subject that interests one. And the subject that interests most writers is, of course, themselves. And it's an easy subject to talk about. But it's always easier if you're a poet or a novelist, because at least you are used to talking in your own voice. You spend your whole lifetime talking as a writer directly to the audience. The problem with being a playwright is that everything you write is for someone else to say. And then if, like me, you also happen to be an actor, everything you say happens to be written by someone else. So one spends most of one's life sort of meeting one's dialogue at a tangent. One's about to meet the dialogue and it goes off in that direction, because one's dialogue is being said by others and what one is saying is written by someone else. It's quite a pleasant existence, actually, because it's not surprising that some of the origins of theatre, at least, are covered in mask. I thought I would just start off with only one little point. The point is, of course, that I wanted to be a poet. The greatest ambition in my life was a poet, and when at the age of 22 I realized I'll not be a poet but only be a playwright, I almost wept, because it seemed so much more was possible. But what is surprising is, well, I'm sorry to autobiographize, but I think that will at least set off some of the terms on which we can talk about later, is when I was about 20, I got a scholarship to go abroad. And it was a very tense moment, because I came from a very traditional family. I was the first member of the family to go abroad. And although the present generation won't understand it, I'm sure many of you who've been through it will understand how difficult it was to come from a traditional family and to go abroad. Because although everyone was thrilled that I was going to England, it involved lots of decisions. Will one come back? Will one stay abroad? Will one get married to a foreign woman? Problems like that. And this kind of thing. And one was very tense, and one found ultimately that suddenly on the eve of my leaving for England, I started writing a play rather than a poem. And it surprised me for three reasons. One thing, that it was a play, because as I said just now, I always wanted to be a poet. The second thing that surprised me was that I wrote in Kannada, because I'd spent all my teenage years preparing to be an English poet. I wanted to go abroad and be in England, the country where Auden and Eliot lived, and, shine there, as it were. And it seemed to me there was nothing to say in India, and therefore I had trained myself to be an English writer. But when it really came to expressing one's tension, they came in Kannada, and I suddenly realized that I'd wasted some years of my life practicing the wrong language. And the third point that surprised me was that it was a play about a myth, Yayati from Mahabharata. All these three things came as a surprise, because, as I said, one thought one was modern, one thought one was alienated from one's background, one thought one was alienated from one's language. And I think to some extent, looking back, one romanticizes the context in which writes, but I think it is true by and large that in the last 150 years, or at least in the last 200 years, if you think of playwriting as a profession in which someone sits down and writes, then it is the art form that has attracted the least number of people in this country. There have been more poets, there have been more novelists, there have been more practitioners of other arts. It's also, I think, by and large true that there have been very few good playwrights and very few good plays. In fact, when I look to what inspires me or what excites me, one automatically goes either, which is of course become fashionable these days, but one does, which is to the folk theatre, or to Shakespeare or Ibsen or something like that. And it is by and large true that certainly in the last 1,000 years, I would say, certainly after the Sanskrit period of Sanskrit drama was over, written drama was over, there's very little, apart from the Sanskrit thing, that really excites one, as an Ibsen would excite one, or a Shakespeare would excite one. My own childhood was spent, if I may mention this briefly, because it will, I think, provide a context for some of the discussion, in a small town called Sirsi, which has a population of about 9 to 10,000 in the 1940s. And I grew up there, and I think this is why I found ultimately theatre was my medium, despite the fact that there really was no theatre when I started writing in Karnataka. Those were the last days of 1940s were the last days of the touring Natak companies in the south. Many of them were flourishing in Maharashtra in the 30s, but by 40s, most of the touring Natak companies, what were the offshoots of the Parsi theatre, were coming to an end. And I was lucky enough to be young enough to see them with my father. And there were two kinds of theatre that were going on in Sirsi. One was this final, dying shape of the Parsi theatre. And the other was, of course, Yakshagana, which was, in those days, considered a very low form of art. It hadn't become purified or acknowledged or accepted as an art form yet. And I remember that the two plays occupied two different kinds of universes. I went with my parents to see the company Natak plays because there were chairs, you sat in chairs, they were invited. My father was a doctor, and in a village like that, it was essential for the Natak companies to keep the doctor happy, because if an actor fell ill, the play could come to an end. So my father always got a pass. And we sat in the front row and we watched these plays, while I always went to the Yakshagana with the servants, because my parents would never have been seen dead watching Yakshagana in those days. It was just considered too lowbrow. And when I had to sit with the servants, the Natak company's plays were on proscenium and they were lit by gas lamps, while naturally the Yakshagana were lit by lantern and very often by torch lamps, because Sirsi didn't have any kind of electricity. Generally, there were two, in fact, the whole aesthetics of the two forms was so different. And one grew up in these without trying to relate both of them and feeling that both of them were dead. And truly, I survived in this kind of a sense of theatre until I came to Bombay practically. I just saw the last of the company Nataks dying, and I thought at that time the last of Yakshagana groups dying. Because in 40s and 50s, until Shivram Karant and others came to its aid, it really was in a very bad shape. And then in the early 60s, one of the most tremendous experiences, which I've talked about elsewhere, in Bombay was to see Strindberg's Miss Julie as produced by Al-Qazi. I think, since then I have been told that it was one of Al-Qazi's very bad productions. I mean, that it was not his best production, and none of his colleagues liked it. But to me, as someone who had come from Sirsi and Dhawar to see it, it was the most extraordinary production, because one thing I had never seen, either on stage or in families, people stripping themselves in such a fashion, you know, to the innermost violence of their being, that two characters could actually stand on stage and strip themselves bare like this and tear each other to pieces, seemed to me almost obscene, because I came from a lower middle class background where, you know, you didn't say things, you kept them, or you were, and certain things were not mentioned and so on. And the other thing, which has always struck me as fascinating about that production, was that for the first time I saw lights dimming, you know, dimmers, lights dimming, which I had never seen before, because I had lived in a town where there was electricity, but like you can switch tone a fan down and reduce its speed, you could also do that with lights. Was an idea that had never occurred to me till that moment. And that you could actually control light and go into darkness, put lights out, and this other notion that you could actually stand there and talk about oneself and talk about the innermost horrors of one's experience. Both of them seemed to me at that time somehow related. Just as the flat lighting of company Nataks was related to its exteriors, this interior of Strindberg seemed very closely related to the kind of lighting that went with it and the way Al-Qazi had played it. Since then, after that, one went abroad and saw a lot of theatre, but to me, the three kinds of theatre, the three kinds between which I have swiveled and moved and written, have been symbolized in a sense by these three kinds of theatre. The company Natak on one side, the Yakshagana with its mask-like appearance, its ritual atmosphere, and thirdly, the kind of theatre which really is a naturalistic theatre, the Western theatre, as one came to see it, hate it, dislike it, but was and have been and is impossible not to be possessed by. I won't go on. As I said, it's a very interesting topic to talk about oneself. I must call a halt to it. If there are any questions, I should be able to. Is that what I do? Throw it open? Yes, thank you.
Why don't you sit down now?
Shall I? No, I don't mind. Oh, really? Okay. Do I have to hold this? Actually, I have a trained voice. I can be heard without, I think. No, I can hold this, okay.
Will you kindly raise your voice?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question if I hear the question, yes.
You saw Kali's play in which you saw that people were stripping on the stage.
No, not physically. No, nothing happens. It's Strindberg, written 19th century. It's what they do to each other. I mean, if they'd stripped on stage, I wouldn't have been so shocked. You know, how emotionally they got into each other, that just shocked me. I'd never seen people do that.
Before that period, which was this period, 40s?
No, this was early 60s when I was in college. I was about 22, 23 years.
But then,
About 20, 21.
who was from Alfred Company, he was already doing this kind of in early 30s.
Well, if he had done this, I haven't seen it, one thing. And it certainly hadn't become, and if we are talking of Master Nisar, who was part of the Company Natak tradition, yeah, but then the Company Natak tradition invariably stylized that kind of thing. You know, Strindberg has a kind of power and a kind of directness which could not possibly have been projected within the contours of Company Natak, I feel, because the whole tradition was different.
For the first time, you might have seen for the first time, but the practice was already there on the stage.
Quite possibly. I can only talk about myself.
Why don't why don't you basically say something more about it? I think the audience hasn't got really as much as to ask you any questions because you haven't said much about your own craft on your writing.
Well, I was hoping not to. I thought, you know, one can get...
Something we will, some will find some question to ask you. Please say something more about your writing, the evolution of your art and craft, and your writing and the directions.
Okay.
I think it will be a
Well,
good
I tried not to say. I thought it was better to, I thought it would be open to questions right from the beginning. What is surprising and what is upsetting as a playwright is the total lack of plays in India. As to why, although the Company Natak tradition started and was so flourishing since the 1830s, even in something like the Marathi Natak tradition, if you look back, which was a very flourishing tradition, I don't know the Bengali tradition, but certainly I have not come across any text, is why this whole Natak company tradition, which flourished as the form of entertainment for the first 100 years, produced such great music, certainly, but did not produce any plays worthwhile. I mean, in Marathi, you occasionally get to talk about a play like Ekats Pyala, which is considered great, or, you know, or Khadilkar's plays, Kichakvad, and so on, for its political references. And the whole problem to me as a playwright has been, and I'm sure this is true of other playwrights as well, I've talked to Vijay about it, Vijay Tendulkar sometimes, and is how do you, if you have to write plays, and if you have to be, I'm sorry, I find it very difficult to formulate this because it's something that I've tried not to formulate to myself. If you want to be a playwright and if you want to write, where do you look for the sources? Why do you write plays in the first place? One thing is, of course, there's no theatre. In fact, this is why I said, sometimes I feel it's unjust to be a playwright. I wish I had been a poet or a novelist or a singer or just an actor, then it would be simpler. Well, I probably got into films in an effort to find some kind of a living audience, because one is a playwright, one finds the need to write plays, there is no theatre, and not only is there no theatre, but there is no really meaningful tradition of theatre within which I have grown up, as I said. Yakshagana at that time seemed moribund, the Natak company tradition was also dying, and the urban theatre, that's the Sangeet Natak tradition, has really left very little in terms of drama. It has left marvelous music. I think if Marathi Sangeet Natak tradition is remembered tomorrow, it will be entirely because of the tremendous music. And for 100 years, it seemed to go from stage to stage to stage, at each stage giving expression to what the country felt and what the audience felt in terms of its musical capability, as somehow the texts were unable to do. So is it purely a personal, if it is a personal expression, what kind of form does one express it in? As I said, my first play, Yayati, I said was about my myths, but what is interesting looking back about it is how strongly it is modeled on Anouilh, Jean Anouill's play. And I think the part of the reason why it is modeled on Anhui is that just as I pay compliments to Al-Qazi for the tremendous influence that Miss Julie had on me, part of the reason was also that Al-Qazi was tremendously influenced by Anhui and used to produce a lot of Anhui's plays. And really the kind of theatre that he opened up to me, I came to approach Anhui through him, John Anhui. And so the first play I really wrote on my way to England, Yayati, is very much like Antigone. And although at that time it seemed to me that I had picked up this theme out of nowhere, now looking back I see that the theme had a certain relevance. The relevance was that it is about the adults, the elder generation demanding of the younger generation that the younger generation should sacrifice itself, should give its youth. You know, Yayati, you probably know the story of Yayati. Yayati is a king who in the prime of his life is cursed to old age. And he goes around asking people, will you take my old age? Will you take my old age? No one accepts except his own son, Puru. So ultimately the son becomes young and the son becomes old and the father becomes young. And I think looking back perhaps at that point it seemed to me very significant that this was what was happening to me, my parents and so on demanding that I should behave in a particular way even when my future seemed to be opening up. So you see, it was a play where the myth in some ways gave exact expression to what I was trying to say, but the form is entirely borrowed from the West. Another interesting example is Andhayug. If you take Andhayug, which I think is one of the most resonant plays written in India, and this is by Dharmavir Bharati, and it was written in the early 50s, and captured in early 50s exactly what partition and all the Holocaust of the post-independence period meant to India. But really it was written as a radio play, it was not written as a stage play. It was as though, and he has never written again. This is an interesting thing. I mean, he has never written a major play again. I think this lack of a stage is a very problematic experience to many playwrights. And with Bharati himself, he wrote it as a radio play. I don't think it was an accident because ultimately the living stage could not be imagined by any of our generation. We had just lost touch with it. The living stage that had come down to us, I think, was fairly dead. And the other stage, which is even the Marathi stage which has come up, I mean, let me talk about it, in which Vijay Tendulkar and others write. Ultimately, the tradition that we borrowed from the West was not the tradition of Shakespeare, was not the tradition of Ibsen so much as the tradition of Shaw. Shaw is the major. Even when Ibsen is imitated, it's the Shaw that comes from it. And surprisingly, what comes through Shaw to us, many of the notions that come from Shaw to us are entirely wrong. For instance, what would be called a contemporary play in the West is always referred to in India as a social play. Or a film is referred to as a social film, and I don't think it's an accident. You see, once 19th century theatre started, and once naturalism started in the West, once it became the major force, from Ibsen to Chekhov to Strindberg to Chekhov to Shaw, these four major playwrights, the major theme on the 19th century European stage was the individual. You know, individualism becomes the major theme, and this you find even in a play like Doll's House, which is the first play of that, which made an impact of that kind of generation. And when Nora walks out on her husband, she's not walking out because of a feminist rebellion. She's walking out because she wants to be seen as a person. She wants to be, she's just sick of being treated as a housewife or whatever roles. It can be seen also as the first individual rebellion against social role-playing. But while the form has been imitated in India endlessly, what is true of Indian society is that individualism hasn't developed. I don't mean in theatre, I mean in society itself. We still play roles. We're expected to play roles. And therefore, our naturalistic theatre has always remained a social theatre, let me put it that way. A social problem-oriented theatre. But the forms that we have inherited, even the way the dialogue is worked out, is very Western. Let me give just one example. All naturalistic plays in the West take place in the drawing room, as you know. I mean, this was a great tradition handed down by Ibsen. The living room of the house is the central point in which the individual, this is the house he has got for himself, from which the individual faces the world outside as well as the tensions inside him, this living room. So from Doll's House through all these playwrights that I mentioned, until Ibsen actually gives up naturalistic theatre, everything happens in the living room. But I think, and this is because the living room has a very important place in Western, not only theatre, but in Western society itself. It is somewhere where the person belongs. But in India, a living room is really a place where you keep the external world out. The only function of a living room in India is to meet guests and give them tea. It is not a place where the family meets and discusses. You know, Indian families, at least the families I know in the South probably, I mean the traditional families, cities have brought a different geography. But the point is the geography of an Indian society is such that right from the gate to the kitchen, the approach of a man and where he is met is graded by his situation in the caste system, really. In the South, this is literally true. An untouchable would be met at the gate. If you belong to a slightly higher caste, probably you would be admitted onto the courtyard. Otherwise, if you are admitted into the house, you would be given tea in the living room. That is where the line is drawn, the Lakshman Rekha, beyond which the outsider would not be allowed. The family really meets inside the kitchen or talks in the kitchen or in the eating place. Along with this goes, there is a complete hierarchy of speeches as to who, in front of who you would speak and in front of who you would not speak. You would talk to your husband probably in the bedroom, but not in the living room in front of your parents, and so on and so on and so on. I need hardly explain the very intricate, the speech patterns, none of which are followed by any of our naturalistic writers, because we have learned them in the West, where everyone comes in the living room and pours out his heart. I mean, women just come and speak. I mean, this is true of even in plays of Adirangacharya. And I've said to Vijay Tendulkar, and I've said it to G.B. Joshi, who's one of our great Kannada playwrights. I said, how people talk in your plays, it's so marvelous to hear them. I've never heard them speak like that in my families, or any families, because, you know, as soon as guests come and outsiders come and so on, everyone just freezes. You know, everyone puts on this great front of everything being right, give him tea, and get rid of the guest first before anyone will start speaking. And this is all happens in the living room. So what I'm saying is that even our geography of the living room, even our understanding of our own homes very often is conditioned by the theater we have learned. This is an example of what I was saying of how we borrow forms. It's not that we do naturalism and that therefore it's wrong. No, that's not what I'm saying. With learning from Ibsen and Shaw, we also learn many bad habits. We learn a bad sociology, a wrong understanding of how we live. And it's amazing how, in fact, then we are unable to write about our own homes. This I find again and again. I mentioned G.B. Joshi, who is now 83 and has written about traditional Kannada society marvelously, but all his characters, including women, come out in the living room and speak. Because when he was young, in his 20s and 30s, he just read Shaw, where everyone came out in the living room and spoke. He admits that this is wrong, but he says it's too late now to correct it. And this kind of, because since I've been asked to speak, sorry, I'm going on now, it will be very difficult to stop me now. The close relationship of an audience, this is where I think the playwrights have read the audience down, and this is why naturalism has not produced anything worthwhile, because even our talking of social plays, even of our talking of social problems, because the two major problems that have been handled by all these people is the way caste system has worked, the untouchables and the people from the what are called the lower castes are handled, and the way women have been exploited. And both these cannot be talked about if you adopt the Ibsenite form of theater, because, you know, if you adopt a system in which the woman from the kitchen will come out in the living room and speak her mind openly and thunder and go out, then there is no problem. The point is we have a society where it can't be done. I mean, you know, that is where the beginning of the problem is. This is equally true where if your living room is a place of open debate where any people from any section of the society can come and express their opinions and go, which again doesn't happen. The point is the man who is affected is not even allowed inside the perimeters of your play. If your play takes place in the living room, the untouchable will be far out there somewhere, from which he is not permitted. And in a sense, I think, if you ask me questions, my answers may be confused. I'm sure they will be confused because, as I said, when one writes plays and one tries to understand these problems, one tries to feel one's way about. The only naturalistic play I have written, called Anju Mallige, has been placed in England, because I just can't think in naturalistic terms in the Indian context, because I just can't think of a stage that is complex enough and am unable to master a speech pattern that is complex enough to express the kind of family life that I would like to talk about. I think it's a weakness on my part. But let me give you an example of how the audience reacts honestly, and this is an example of a play we did in Madras. You may know this play. It's called, Arthur Miller's View from the Bridge. Now you must know this play. It's a well-known Arthur Miller play. It's about an Italian worker called Eddie Carbone, who's a dock worker. I'll briefly tell you the story so that you know. Yeah, but for those who don't know, let me quickly. And this dock worker hides two illegal immigrants in his house, you know, and they're trying to get into. And he has a niece living with him, and he's looking after the niece. And one of the illegal immigrants falls in love with the niece. And Eddie Carbone says the play has an incestuous passion for the niece. And he's so possessive about his niece because of his incestuous passion that he betrays one of the dock workers to the immigrants, and the second one kills him, and he dies. So this is, in a way, Arthur Miller's attempt to bring Greek tragedy into 20th century, and everything is right, you know. There's a tragic flaw. What's the tragic flaw? He has an incestuous passion for his niece. He betrays, you know, everything, Hamartia, the Enlightenment, the whole thing happens quite correctly, as per Aristotle. And we have a view from the bridge. But we played this play in Madras, and to me the experience was quite extraordinary a few years ago, because the play was a great success. Most of our audience was Western oriented. They had been abroad. They knew Western society very well. They saw the play. There were tears at the end of it. I did Eddie Carbone and so on. But the funny thing is that whereas in the Western, whatever productions I've seen, Eddie Carbone comes as a very unpleasant person, you know, whose incestuous relationship is unforgivable. In our production, as we played it, not because we played it like that, but I think the audience, he came across as a very sympathetic person, and most of the audience couldn't understand what the incest was doing, what the hell the incest was doing in the play. Because the general response of the audience was, look, here's an uncle, here's an orphan niece staying with him. He's quite right to look after her. What's all this fuss about? I mean, here are two illegal immigrants who are coming into the house. They don't even have a future. And if one of them is up to marry the niece, he's quite right to stop it. So, you know, in fact, what came through to most of the audiences was that the illegal immigrants were not quite right to do what they do, you know, which is to fall in love. I mean, they had been given a house to live in, for Christ's sake. You don't fall in love with a girl in the house where you get hospitality. So, in fact, the whole set of values got topsy-turvy. You know, it was a different play that the audience was watching, quite different from what we were playing. And ultimately, you know, when we discussed with the audience, we suddenly realized that the whole thing was wrong. You know, another play had been running in the auditorium and since then, I have found this again and again and again. For instance, I had this discussion again. With Miller, it happens beautifully because he is in the tradition of Ibsen and Chekhov, and as you know, he's in the naturalistic tradition, so all this kind of interpretation in social this. For instance, when China opened its borders to America, and they invited a play, the first play they invited was Death of a Salesman, you know, and in America this was felt that this was because Death of a Salesman attacked capitalism, you know, and in America it's seen as a critical of capitalism, and that's why the Chinese must have but when I was talking, I said, you're mad. I mean, you know, if you think they think Death of a Salesman is attacking capitalism, you know, the man has a car and goes out in a car and all that sort of thing. What they see in it is probably a good family drama. You know, the man has no future, he's trying to build up a future, and ultimately the play shows that he has failed in terms of his two sons. You know, he has let his wife down, and ultimately what he can't keep alive is his image in the eyes of his son. He's a failure in the eyes of his son. He can't keep his family going. And this is probably what makes it so attractive. You think it's for an ideological reason that they're inviting it, but they're probably inviting it for a purely melodramatic reason. They love the play, you know, quite possible. Simply because that's how I saw it when, you know, when saw it in Bombay, because one became aware of this kind of interpretations. But I'm talking of a view from the bridge in that sense. What happens is an audience interprets a play, and I think a really important work and a really important play or important drama is created, something like Shakespeare or Ibsen is created, when the audience and the playwright to somewhere hit a common point of expression. I mean, the audience may not accept it immediately. It may become a controversial play, like Ibsen was, you know, was hounded for a long time because his plays were misunderstood by the audience. But somewhere a truth is touched upon. I don't know how to express it any better. And I often feel that while a play like Andha Yug has managed to do it, even in our generation, a play like Ghashiram Kotwal has done it, or even, I think, even Sakharam Binder of Tendulkar is one of the great plays of our generation, and probably of the last 100 years. Our problem with playwriting in India is that this hasn't happened. Very often, the playwrights have either written in such a traditional manner which has lost relevance to their urban existence, or they have written in such an urbanized manner, westernized manner, that it has lost relevance to the traditional part of their personality. We keep acrobating between the traditional us and the modern us, and perhaps we have not hit upon a form which balances both, because, for instance, after going to Ghashiram Kotwal, which I thought was one of Tendulkar's great plays, since then he's gone back again to the drawing room plays. I mean, his form basically has been in forms like whichever that play was about the girl who sold, Kamala and so on. He's all back again to Ek Hatti Mulgi and that kind of thing. Is that enough, you think?
Since you have said so much.
चाहेंगे कि आप थोड़ा तुगलक की रचना प्रक्रिया के बारे में शेयर योर एक्सपीरियंस उस दौरान जो रचना वो काफी लोगों ने देखा भी है, तो एक संवाद बनेगा उससे। हयवदन एंड तुगलक काफी लोगों ने देखा है, और ये नेहरू ईरा में लिखा था, और आज जितना रेलेवेंस है, जैसे आज अजीम साहब ने संवाद दिया कि जिनके मंसूबों में कंगाली है।
Okay. You see, the problem always is.
Please tell us, why were you inspired to write a historical like Tughlaq, and why you haven't found any other character in history to write another relevant play today?
I'm writing a historical play now. So. I'm not a very, I'm sorry to start with I, but I mean, I don't know how I can help it. Not a very prolific playwright. Simply, I've written only about 5-6 plays in the last 25 years. The reason simply is that once I write a play, I feel that's it. That's the end of that. Now I'd better go back to acting or something else to make a living, because I just feel that everything is finished. I mean, everything I had to say, and there's nowhere to begin. And literally that happened to me after Yayati. I had written this play, as I said, when I was going abroad, and I didn't know what to do. So I was reading all kinds of books in an effort that I'll find a plot, some plot that will inspire one to do this. And then a major Kannada critic called Kirtinath Kurtkoti had at that time written the whole history of Kannada literature. He's a very important critic. And there he writes in one point that what Shakespeare has done with Richard III, with his own history, or what has been done with a play like Boris Godunov, for instance. What has been done with history in the West again and again, or even Brecht did with all his historical plays, particularly Galileo and so on, we have not been able to do. It is a categorical statement. He says there is no Indian playwright who has been able to handle history. All we have produced is costume plays. So I said, there is something. Now, why have we not been able to do? I mean, I didn't know what to write about. So literally, I picked up a second standard book of Indian history and started from Mohenjo-daro to read, to see whether one wouldn't hit upon some subject which would, which one could say, as Kirtinath Kurtkoti had done, to make it relevant, as it were. And when I came to Tughlaq, I said, oh, marvelous, that's what I wanted. Because in those days, as you know, existentialism was very much in the air. So to be considered mad was very much fashionable. I mean, you were mad and you did this acte gratuit and, all this kind of thing. So everything about Tughlaq seemed to fit into what I had read was the correct thing to do, which was to be mad and do impossible things and so on and so on. But so I started reading Tughlaq. I'm sorry to be facetious, but it's not. I'm not trying to be facetious, but that's how it started. But as I started reading about Tughlaq, I suddenly realized what a fantastic character I had hit upon. I mean, I started with Ishwari Prasad, History of Corona Turks, and then went on to read all contemporary material. And suddenly one felt possessed, and one felt this character was growing in front of one, and he certainly was the most extraordinary character to come on the throne of Delhi. And in religion, in philosophy, even in calligraphy, even in battle, warfare, anything you talk about, he seems to have outshone anyone who came before him or after him. So after that, writing a play was not difficult at all. What was difficult was how to leave out what one loved about him. I mean, I really feel that although the play has been very successful and has had a tremendous success on stage and so on, and particularly because actors are like doing the role, really I don't think I did full justice to what comes through when you read someone like the History of Corona Turks, what the character comes through, because that was marvelous. The second reason why that I was also happy with it is, as I said, by that time I had felt that I was sick of John Anway, I was sick of Sartre, although they had led me to Tughlaq, and therefore the play is deliberately written in the convention of the company natak. At least the attempt was that. In a company natak, what used to happen, at least in the company nataks that I had seen, was there's a proscenium, and all scenes were divided, alternated into, one was called the deep scene and one was called the shallow scene. Now the shallow scene was usually a street scene and usually was kept for comedy. And while the shallow scene was on, the deep scene was being prepared for a garden, a palace, a dance scene, whatever. The sets were being changed. And while the set change was going on, the shallow scene, you had comical characters. So this continual altering of shallow scenes and deep scenes, this is what I attempted there, because in the shallow scenes you have comical characters, crowds. It's actually a degeneration from Shakespearean kind of playwriting, really. And then the curtain opened and you were in palace. And the characters of the play were clearly divided into those which came into shallow scenes and those which came into deep scenes. Now this I started off with, at least the first half of the play is written like that, but as I went on writing the play, the form developed on its own, and in the end, Aziz, one of the characters which is meant to be comical, ends up in the palace, which seemed to me right, given the political chaos that one was writing about. No, I did not consciously write about the Nehru era. I'm always flattered when people tell me that, it was about the Nehru era, and equally applies to development of politics since then. But I think, well, that's a compliment that any playwright would be thrilled to get, I think. But it was not intended to be a contemporary play about contemporary situation. I think if one gets involved with one's characters or one's play, then it should develop into some kind of a true statement about oneself. I think a play can be only as contemporary as the playwright is. If the writer himself is not contemporary or does not have contemporary convictions or is not committed, the play will not, you cannot be fashionably committed or fashionably involved. If you are involved, those issues will come. What you are not involved don't emerge. This is the first thing. With Hayavadana, of course, by the late 60s, any seminar you went to India, the question was what to do with folk theatre. And this problem was endlessly debated, and people said it's relevant, it's not relevant, what to do with it, etc., etc. I heard of Shanta Gandhi's production of Jasma Odhan, about which everyone talked about, although I never got a chance to see it until much later, until Nasir did it. And all that meant that folk theatre was very much in air. And one day I was telling the story of transposed heads to my friend B.V. Karant. I said, no, there is this beautiful story, transposed heads, and why don't we make a film? And he said, but why a film? It will make marvelous theatre. And the moment he said it, I knew that it would make a very good play. It was actually theatrical and not a film. It would have been a bad film probably, but a good theatre. And just at that time, I think to some extent Badal Sarkar has done himself great injustice by claiming that he is not influenced by folk theatre. He probably isn't influenced by folk theatre. But the form of Evam Indrajit has a lot of fluidity, which I had just translated and produced Evam Indrajit. And I must confess that the fluidity of Evam Indrajit had a lot to do with my writing Hayavadana. So while one confesses that one went consciously to some of the folk theatre, Yakshagana and other backgrounds, one cannot deny that Brecht as well as Badal Sarkar were haunting one somewhere. And that went some way in the shaping of Hayavadana.
What is your consistent, has you have a consistent approach in your writing, in your plays? Are you a committed man? Are you writing something with a purpose? If the purpose is what is it social, political? What purpose you are writing for? What are you writing for your plays? Okay. Have you got a consistent approach towards what? Have you got a message? That is one part of the question. And the second thing is, the question is, you are also concerned as the chairman of the Karnataka Academy. What is it that perhaps I have felt that the plays here in our country have not contributed to any type of consciousness, social consciousness, political consciousness among the people?
Yes.
I mean, compared to the novel, for example. Not that I'm a novelist, but I just feel like this has been happening all over the country. While in Europe, and America also to a certain extent, and in the Soviet Union, the plays have played a much bigger role in the political consciousness as well as the social consciousness of the people.
Right.
What do you think are the reasons for that? And
okay.
Since you are now in a position also to say so.
Okay. Well, I'll answer the second question first, or I can answer the first question first. Well, I write, as I said, because I have to write. I mean, I don't know why I write. I mean, I don't write with a purpose. I hope my plays have a purpose. I hope they have a message, but I don't know them. I mean, I write because I can't stop myself from writing, and every time I write, what one does is occasionally, sometime, as I said, an idea possesses one, one wants to share it. And I don't know what a poet feels. I wish I knew. He probably communicates directly. It's probably like a love letter. But a playwright, unfortunately, is condemned to sharing it with 1,000 people. That's what play is. I mean, it has to communicate. So, in fact, it is, you get excited and you want to share it, and that's why I write. That's all I can say. I can't. But the second question is very interesting, and that relates to the problem I said earlier, because I think what we understand by urban theatre today is really the 19th century company natak tradition, which came with the British theatre, and in the 1930s started with the Parsi companies, and then in Bengal had a different this. In fact, it brought in a whole lot of new concepts which were until then not known to Indian theatre. For instance, it has been much talked about. It has been pointed out, for instance, that one of the great innovations of the Parsi theatre was the proscenium stage, which divided the audience from the stage. But what is very often not taken into consideration, that a greater innovation was ticketing. The moment you asked the audience to pay for the tickets, a whole new relationship was brought in, which has never existed before. Traditional plays were always sponsored plays, sponsored by kings, sponsored by ministers, sponsored by temples, so that an audience could come and take a kind of aesthetic risk. But once you say to an audience, you have to pay for the ticket, then he comes for, as he would come for, it becomes a, well, to use a cliche, if you'll forgive me, a commodity. And then he starts judging the commodity in terms of the money he's paying for it. And then he decides whether he's got 2 rupees worth of entertainment or not, 5 rupees worth of entertainment or not, you know, where he sits. It's interesting, for instance, that I think this has a lot to do with it, that in traditional performances, certainly of Kathakali and Yakshagana that I've known, children and women sit in front and men sit at the back. While in a company natak, it was all the highest paid people who used to sit in front, like my father, or those with passes, the free people. Now, really, before I would say, I mean, there may be which I may have missed, sorry, I'm not saying, which I would say, as I'm saying, while there is so much music that is first rate, and presumably in those days there was so much spectacle that was first rate, because whenever you think of the great productions of that period by Gubbi Veeranna or Manapman and Balgandharv and so on, you either talk of the music or you talk of the tremendous spectacle, how Balgandharv used to change saris for every song. And even in Marathi theatre, as everyone knows, there was a period where whole parts of the audience used to move out after a song was over and come back only for the next singing. In effect, therefore, this is one of the reasons, I think, that while in the West, when films came, they certainly affected the theatre, but they did not destroy it. You know, the theatre continued, as you say, it still continues to some extent. In India, it absolutely decimated theatre because the films could do everything that the theatre could do much better and much cheaper, and with greater economies of scale. And the theatre had not produced any kind of what is essentially a theatrical experience, an intellectual theatrical experience, say, in terms of a really strong play that makes you think, you know, that experience, for people to associate theatre with at all. You know, if you make it an entirely musical theatre, then of course the films can do it better. I mean, they can produce 50-piece orchestras as against 12-piece orchestras, have better musicians, have better singers, and have playback singing. They can reproduce every one of those things better. I'm not condemning it. All I'm saying is that what you say is very true, and it's always been a mystery to me why it happened. That Indian theatre, despite being the sole and the most dominating form of entertainment for nearly 100 years, produced no texts. Presentation of any medium that gets you to them. Certainly one's attracted to TV. I mean, and I think it's, yes. Yes, one is it. I don't know, I haven't done anything except act on it. That way I may have lost my audience. But the point is, it's certainly, well, I would certainly not turn my back on television, because any medium that takes you to people is such a marvelous challenge to do, I think. Yes? Well, I don't know why not, because I think, well, it's very difficult to answer that question really. I think it's because, I think part of the reason is the enormous dominance of British culture on us through the 20s and 30s, which inevitably meant that of Shaw. You know, because the kind of things I'm talking about, if you look at Chekhov, he manages very well. I mean, most of Chekhov's characters are not saying what they're meant to be saying. I mean, they're saying something else, and they're not directly saying anything, but the tragedy of it comes through beautifully. I mean, it's almost like an Indian family, what it describes. I mean, various people talking tangentially, not saying, the silences, the pauses. And it's easy enough to say, well, if we were influenced by Chekhov instead of Shaw, we would have found the answer. I don't know. But well, Chekhov certainly for himself found an answer to the straitjacket of that kind of naturalistic theatre. I think we didn't find. I mean, to answer to your first question, what is the Sangeet Natak Academy doing? The answer is the Sangeet Natak Academy is. It is. I mean, that's what it is. It is, it was formed some 40 years ago to look after Indian theatre, dance, drama, and I think it has done it, sometimes well, sometimes not well, but it is the one agency that's done it. And I think, however much criticizes the Sangeet Natak Academy, it cannot be denied that it's played a very valuable role, both at the center, also at the stage, that it has been responsible for the revival of many forms, has been responsible for many seminars which have created new ideas. Now, one can always say that it could have done better. Of course, it could have done better. Any odd institution could have done better. Certainly, this is not to say that what the Sangeet Natak Academy should be doing now is crystal clear to me. It's not crystal clear to me because certainly the cultural scene is much more complex today than it used to be. There are many more organizations in the scene, and while one says that the Sangeet Natak Academy is the primary organization and should look after anything, it may also be unfair to say that the Festival of India, the ICCR, the other organizations, zonal commissions, etc., should not be there, because the more cultural organizations there are, it's possible to argue, the better it is for the artist, for the audience, because they make it possible to bring the artist to the audience and the audience to the artist. All I can say at the moment in terms of your question is that particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been a lot of other organizations from the Sangeet, other than Sangeet Natak Academy, which have been very active and very fruitfully active, possibly in the Sangeet Natak, in the cultural field, as was not the case, say, 10 years ago, until 10 years ago, when Sangeet Natak Academy was more or less the one organization which looked after the fact. So the scene is fluid, it's very complex, and I hope soon we'll get our bearing and they will get their bearing. That's the answer. Yes. Several projects. We want to hold a workshop for, you probably know that the theatre academy in Pune had a playwrights workshop over the last 2-3 years, which was very successful, which produced half a dozen plays which are supposed to be very good. 1 or 2 are very good. I have not read the other. We want to do something like that on a national scale. We also want to back, if possible, not just give small sums of money to different productions, but try and back repertory companies. And say not just indigenous theatre, any kind of theatre, because ultimately, well, kitchen sink is not very far from naturalistic theatre. It's a very naturalistic sink there. Although it's... No, that's what I'm saying. All kinds of theatre, we hope, will be open, because any kind of... when you have a rich theatrical tradition like in the West, they can afford to specialize and say, now this is a time for expressionism or kitchen sink or whatever it is. What we need to create is a whole body of theatre. Street, yes, absolutely. Any kind of good theatre, we hope we'll be able to back groups, not just for 1 show or 2 shows, but for a couple of years, say to a group, act like a repertory and give. Now, this is what the executive board, when they met last, decided. So I think I'm not just giving vent to my own personal opinions, but what the executive board felt, and I hope that we'll be able to put it into
Can I ask you a very personal question?
Yes.
Does your acting help you write your next play?
No, it doesn't. Well, it helps to the extent that when I write, I'm acting, I think. I mean, I'm acting the different roles. But if you mean, does my profession of acting help? No, it doesn't. In fact, I'll try to keep the two separate. I hope my characters act better than I do. When the Indian festival, it changed the whole scene. I was associated with South Asia departments and so on immediately after I can tell you that many people told me that if they went to a funding system like Rockefeller, whatever it is, and say, we want to do something in India, certainly immediately the help was forthcoming after the Festival of India. That is, India, the kind of blitzkrieg, cultural blitzkrieg we carried on certainly had a tremendous impact in those kind of departments. That's all I can say. Because you can look at it from 2 points of view. The question is whether it was meant to help Indian artists or whether it was meant to have an impact on America. I think it was meant to have an impact abroad. And that's why we're having it abroad. And it had an impact. I don't think that can be denied at all.
आजकल जो आप लिख रहे हैं, लिखना चाहते हैं, उसके बारे में थोड़ी डिटेल बताइए कि आजकल आप क्या लिख रहे हैं, उसका विषय क्या है?
You see, the only danger, the reason why I would not like to talk about what I want to write is, every time one sets out to write, one thinks one's going to write the great play, you know. This is it. This is the play after which Shakespeare will pale into insignificance. And that's for about 2-3 years one puts into it and puts all one's efforts into it and so on. But I'm afraid very few really mature into anything. I mean, they don't happen. The number of half-completed, quarter-completed drafts I have would fill the National Library, actually. So I would not like to speak about what I intend to do. All I can say is that I've just written a play called Nagamandal, which fascinated me because it's from a collection of folk tales collected by Professor Ramanujan of the University of Chicago. I feel that while in the early 70s we all talked of folk theatre, and we all did it, and most of us wrote, I wrote Haivadan, Kambar's Jokmar Swami came at the same time, Tendulkar's Ghashiram Kotwal came. Nothing more happened. I mean, we just took what theatre we knew as folk theatre, we made use of it, but then we didn't go on from there, I think. I mean, we just left it. Tendulkar has gone back to naturalistic theatre. I haven't written anything. And I felt that if it is really Indian, then something of that experience at least must stay on. I mean, I don't want to write another play that starts with a Ganapati. When I told my wife, who's just come from America, that let's go and see an Indian play, she said, if I see another Ganesha coming on stage, I'm going to scream, she said. So, because it is true that what's called folk theatre has become a lot of gimmicks now, and a lot of predictable gimmicks. You can, even before the scene begins, you can say this is how it's going to develop, because a certain number of same tricks are being put together. But I think what is called folk theatre has an experience and an ability and a flexibility which should go beyond just using of the facial things like masks and superficial things like the mask and Ganesha and Puja and so on. Certainly if it's sustained for 1,000 years, it should be capable of yielding more. And that's what I hope I'll be able to do. I hope I'll be able to do with this play of Ramanujan's, which is a very beautiful folk tale. Yeah. This is called Nagamandal. Beautifully. I mean, you feel. In fact, everyone says English is going down, but the number of excellent writers in English that are coming up. I mean, not just someone like Salman Rushdie who grew up in England, but Amitav Ghosh, Upamanyu Chat. Not one or two. So many of the Vikram Seth. I mean, unbelievable. Golden Gate. I couldn't believe when I read it. I mean, that anyone could actually do it. It is such a marvelous book. So I think if someone can do it, they can do it. I wouldn't generalize on it. I think language is such a personal thing that happens to you. You must tell me when I stop.
The last.
Okay. Well, Kazi very much, and I said he has a very big role to play. I wouldn't say that it stopped with his going. What happened simply is that Indian theatre just didn't become professional. Those of us who were in it couldn't make a living. I mean, I was on one side in theatre, on another side what's called experimental cinema. And at some point I said, for Christ's sake, I've got to get married. I mean, I just can't go on like this. I mean, earning enough to live from day to day. And that's when I switched to Hindi films when they asked me. Because it's impossible for anyone to make a living in the present state of theatre. And this is true of playwrights, this is true of actors and of directors. This is why a lot of talent inevitably has to go to other forms where money is available, like television, film. I don't think that's wrong, but I hope that at least some of them retain a certain kind of loyalty to theatre so that they sustain theatre, because it's unfortunate. And this is why I said that the Sangeet Natak Academy would like to hold and give a backing to certain repertory groups, for a year, 2 years, rather than just one show. Because that is what's required. For a group to be able to sustain itself for 2 years and say, okay, over the next 2 years we'll do 4 plays or 5 plays, and this is our program, and not worry, because it is true that nowhere in the world is theatre entirely dependent on ticket sales. It's not, even in England they've got now national theatre, as you know, and outside London theatre is a very difficult business, so it is in America. And all over Europe theatre is subsidized theatre, and some kind of subsidy is required, I think. Only that will make it possible for playwrights to come forward and actors to continue in theatre if they want to continue. A lot of us went into films very, very unwillingly.
Just a corollary of it. How would you explain the decline of IPTA? I mean, was it that the political play no longer became the fashion, or was it also the same for a professional problem of the artist?
I couldn't say. I mean, I always watched IPTA and admired it, but I really wasn't associated with it close enough to talk with authority on its history. Yes. Yes, I'll come to that.
Most of the plays which I'm talking about and we are aware of, they're written in sort of the last maybe 30, 40 years, very good plays, including yours, but they have been mainly spectacle plays. But now you're talking, earlier on how sort of our societies that women can't don't talk, and all that is what you're talking about. But hardly any plays are written which mirror the society, because I think what really is required that people can see themselves. But now all these various plays that have been written are beautiful plays, wonderful plays, but they are spectacular plays, but it doesn't really make them see themselves in the contemporary sort of time. Because I think we really need plays which really can, the people sort of not only see the plays, but a lot of the Western plays, some than others, they really also reflected the society.
I agree that there haven't been too many, but there have been a few. I mean, for instance, I have always been a great admirer of Shantata Kotsaloe, and certainly more than that, of Sakharam Binder, which I think is a... Yes, it should be. Yeah, I know. I agree with you. I mean, thank you.
Playwrights like you and others who are writing those plays.
Thank you, Girish Karnad.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I wish my audience for my plays would stay as quietly. Thank you.
Friends, we have had, fortunately, not a ticketed but a sponsored performance. Shows that the tradition of sponsored performances has much to contribute to the sharing of experience without a calculating mind at the end of it. But if I were to make a calculation, I must say that whatever the efforts the two sponsoring institutions have put in are far outweighed by the benefit that we have derived. It is not what he has told us. Perhaps many of the things he has told us we knew, or we could imagine, or we suspected, or we could find out after some research. But it is the sharing of an experience in first person, singular, in terms of a whole development of art, or rather arts, which speak to each other. In Mr. Girish Karnad's writings, one finds the fulfillment of what Dr. Radhakrishnan used to say, that Indian literature is one, but written in different languages. This is how one shares the sensibility, Indian, international, world sensibility. For Girish Karnad belongs to India, and yet he is not one who turns his face away from the rest of the world. May I say this, that one has not heard a more honest, a more sincere, a more humble, a more communicative, a more realistic, reflective and forthright sharing of the innermost experience of an author who is not merely an author. He's a great deal more. And it all comes out in an integrated approach to life, to art, to writing, without pretensions, without hypocrisy. A certain standard of candor which shows how transparent is the faith of the writer in the writing and not to the message. There is that very beautiful saying of Bhavbhuti, of which I am reminded. And he said, if I may translate it, he said, I do not know how it happened that in one body, in one person, so many qualities, guna samaharasya sannivesha katam eva abhut. How did it happen that in one person, so many arts, so many abilities, so many talents found a confluence, as it were? It is this confluence of a living dialogue, a living interaction of different ways that we rejoice in, that we celebrate in Girish Karnad's creativity. He wanted to be a poet, and he regretted that he is not. But I do not know whether one can draw a line between a poet and a playwright and an actor. It's all a part of a continuum, perhaps. And it is perhaps right to say that a poet, a painter, a sculptor, a playwright are all made of one stuff. And it expresses itself. It is fortunate for us all, it's fortunate for our literary traditions that we have a person who is able to bring to us this confluence of the interaction and the interaction of different forms of art, different experiences and different sensibilities. It was a feast indeed this evening at which we sat and shared of a very rich saga of a very young life. For Girish Karnad is, as you know, the youngest person to be the chairman of the Sangeet Natak Academy. He was a young celebrity many years ago. And I must tell you that long before I came to know him, and I had the privilege of knowing him as a very wonderful member of the National School of Drama Society, of which I was the chairman then, and he was the most valuable member. But long before I came to know him, I knew of him, as many of us. And I must say, his own personal contribution, his own personal presence is never eclipsed by his reputation, which is very great. We celebrate his great reputation as we celebrate him in person. Thank you very much, Girish Karnad, for coming to us this evening, for sharing with us, and for giving us the sense of belonging. Thank you.